My name is Victor Ellison, and I am 66 years old, and I spent 24 years as a family court judge in a mid-sized county in the Southeast. And I want you to understand something about family court before I tell you what happened in my own family. Because family court is not about law. People assume it is about the particular damage that happens. When people who are supposed to protect each other choose destruction. Instead, and I watched that damage arrive in my courtroom in different configurations for 24 years, and I thought I had seen every variation, and I had not, because the variation that arrived in my own house was one I had not anticipated, and I want to start by telling you about my stepson Marcus before I tell you what he did. Because Marcus came into my life when he was 17 years old, and I married his. Mother Diane and Marcus was not difficult the way some stepchildren are. Difficult, he was simply absent in the specific way of a young man who has decided that the world owes him a comfortable passage, and that the people around him exist to provide it, and I recognize this quality because I had watched it arrive in my courtroom many times attached to much older men, and it worried me, and I said so to Diane twice, and Diane said I was being too judicial about everything, and she was not entirely wrong, but I was not entirely wrong either, and my son James was 22 when Marcus moved into our house. James was mine from my first marriage, a quiet, careful young man who worked at an automotive shop and attended community college in the evenings, and James had a girlfriend named Priya who was 21 and studying nursing, and who came to Sunday dinner every few weeks and sat at our table with the careful politeness of someone who is trying very hard to belong, and I liked Priya, and I told James so, and the Sunday dinners continued, and Marcus was present at some of them, and at the ones he attended I noticed the way he watched Priya, which was not the way a person watches someone they consider a brother's girlfriend. It was something else, and I filed it away and said nothing because a retired judge learns to wait for evidence before drawing conclusions, and the evidence arrived on a Thursday evening in March when Priya called me. Directly not. James directly me, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who has held something alone for longer than they should have, and she told me that she was pregnant, and she told me that the child was not James's, and she told me who the father was, and I sat in my study after that call, and I did not move for a long time, and what I felt was not anger, it was the specific grief of a man who recognized a pattern he had seen in his courtroom 100 times and had hoped would never arrive in his own house, and I called David, my personal attorney, the next morning, not because I needed legal advice immediately, but because 24 years on the bench had taught me that the moment you suspect something significant is developing, you establish counsel. And David and I talked for an hour, and I told him everything. And David said, "Victor, what do you want the outcome to be?" And I said, "I want the truth documented, and I want James protected." And David said, "Then let's start there." And over the following 3 weeks I was methodical, the way I had always been methodical. I requested a paternity test through a private clinic with David as the coordinating attorney, so that the chain of custody was clean and legally defensible, and Priya cooperated completely, and when the results came back, they confirmed what she had told me on the Thursday phone call, and I had those results notarized and filed with David's office, and I had a second document, which was a statement from Priya, prepared with David's, assistance that was signed and witnessed and specific about the timeline, and the circumstances, and then I had a third document, which was a text, record that Priya had preserved on her phone in which Marcus had told her explicitly that if she told James or told me, he would deny everything and make her life very difficult, and I sat with those 3 documents in. My study and I thought about 24 years of watching families destroy themselves in my courtroom, and I thought about James, who did not yet know, and I thought about the particular damage that happens when people who are supposed to protect each other choose destruction, and I told James on a Saturday morning at my kitchen table with David present, because I had learned in 24 years that difficult truths land better when there is a witness and a structure, and James sat across from me and listened, and when I finished, he did not cry immediately, he simply looked at the table for a very long time, and then he said, "Dad," and I said, "I know." And he said, "How long have you known?" And I said, 3 weeks, and he said, "Why did you wait?" And I said, "Because I needed the evidence to be complete before you had to carry it." And he looked at me for a moment, and then he nodded the way my son has always nodded when he understands something he does not like, and I presented the documents to Marcus and Diane together the following Tuesday evening, and Marcus looked at the paternity results, and then he looked at the text record, and the particular expression that crossed his face was one I had seen in my courtroom many times. It was the expression of a person who has just understood that the architecture of denial they have been constructing is not going to hold, and Diane sat very still and said nothing for a long time, and then she said, "Victor," and I said, "Diane, I have the documents, and the documents say what they say," and Marcus said, "Those texts are out of context," and I said, "Marcus, I spent 24 years on the bench, and I know what out of context looks like, and this is not it." And Marcus and Diane left my house that evening, and James and I sat in the kitchen for an hour without talking much, because sometimes silence is the appropriate container for what a family is carrying. And Marcus was removed from our home, and the legal matters that followed regarding Priya and the child were handled correctly and completely with David's guidance, and James took a long time to find his footing again, the way young men do when the ground shifts under them without warning, but he found it, and he is steadier now than he was before, in the specific way that people are steadier after they have survived something they did not think they could survive. And I still sit on the bench of my study on Sunday mornings with coffee, and I think sometimes about the 24 years and the particular damage that happens in families, and I think about James at my kitchen table looking at the surface for a long time, and I think about the 3 documents that David filed correctly, and I think that 24 years of watching families break taught me exactly one useful thing, which is that the truth does not need your help to be true. It simply needs someone willing to document it carefully and wait.